Okay, hello everyone from Los Angeles. My name is Kevin Harris. I'm a professor of sociology here at University of California, Los Angeles. I'm a co-director of the UCLA Center for Social Theory and Comparative History, along with my colleagues Robert Brenner and Chin-Quan Lee. Welcome to the final panel that we're holding this winter quarter of 2022 here in the center. On the general theme of the political economy of rising authoritarianism. So far this quarter, we've had panels on the Middle East, on China, and on India. And today, we're extending out this thematic series with a stellar set of scholars and speakers on Southeast Asia and Latin America. And we've titled the panel today, After the Commodity Boom, Fragile Democracies in Southeast Asia and Latin America. If you're in the audience and wish to ask a question in the Q&A portion of our panel, we will unmute your video and audio. You can ask the question directly to the panelists, and you can raise your digital hand in preparation for that. So I'm going to introduce the speakers and our discussant, and we'll get started. So we have an amazing set of speakers today for this panel, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to present. First is Professor Alfredo Saad-Filho, who's Professor of Political Economy and International Development at King's College London. He's published numerous books and articles, as well as contributions to the United Nations and other international development agencies. He's been published in numerous languages, and currently is researching the political economy of Brazil, especially the transition from import substitution to neoliberalism, and from military dictatorship to democracy. Next up, we're going to feature Julia Buxton, who's British Academy Global Professor at the University of Manchester. Julia's research focuses on illicit drug markets, on development. She has expertise on Venezuela and has published in 2017 the book, The Failure of Political Reform in Venezuela. And I read many of Julia's essays in New Left Review and NACLA, and learned much from her perspective on Venezuela and America. And then our third speaker is going to be Professor Dan Slater, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, who specializes in democratization and authoritarianism with a regional focus on Southeast Asia. His 2010 book, Ordering Power, Contentious Politics and Authoritarian Leviathans in Southeast Asia, is a landmark book in political science, political sociology, and a study of Southeast Asia. I know he has a book in the works with Professor Joshua Wong. I think the title is Democracy Through Strength, about democratization in unlikely cases. And then finally, we have an excellent discussant, almost tailor-made for our panel, which is Professor Barbara Geddes, Professor Emerita from the Department of Political Science at UCLA, one of the best-known scholars on authoritarianism and social science. Originally worked on Latin America, and her most recent book with a set of co-authors is called How Dictatorships Work, Power, Personalization, and Collapse, came out in 2018. So we're going to start with Alfredo, and each speaker has about 20 minutes to present on the topic, and then we'll have Barbara's comments, and then we'd like to hear from you in the audience. This panel is being recorded and will be put online for public consumption afterwards. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks everybody for joining us. Alfredo, please.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk to you today. I will start by stressing three features of Latin America, which I think are relevant for our conversation. The first is that Latin America has always been characterized by social exclusion and by vast inequalities of income, wealth, and privilege. The second is that the region historically has tended to be ruled by narrow elites that operate in and through states that were created to enforce social exclusion, oligarchic rule, and the most brutal exploitation of nature and the majority of the population. And this is why those states tend to respond vigorously when inequality and privilege are challenged from below. And they, at the same time, they tend to react ambiguously and weakly when the rules of the game are challenged by sections of the elite or by foreign powers. And this has historically tended to lead to recurrent social conflicts and instability at the top. And the consequence is that economic policy in the region has tended to be at the same time incoherent, volatile, and heavy-handed. Third feature is that Latin American states have always intervened heavily to promote and to regulate economic activity. That will include enforcing property rights, provision of labor, infrastructure, finance, foreign exchange, the promotion of selected economic activities, and so on. Now, the state has then traditionally both an exclusionary role and a transformative role in Latin America. And this is part of the reason why those states have tended to be very strong vertically and acting decisively to subdue native populations, slaves, poor immigrants, peasants, wage workers, and so on. And at the same time, they tend to be weak states horizontally with very limited capacity to manage conflicts within the elite and between the elite and their external counterparts. Those disputes, they tend to be addressed through bargaining, through corruption, or through political capture. And the consequence is that one of the basic principles of the formulation and implementation of policy in Latin America is pragmatism. And at the same time, those conflicts also tend to limit policy efficacy, and they lead to inconsistent economic strategies in the region. And I'm saying this to highlight continuities. And one of my main points today is that Latin America has not changed very much in recent decades, and these continuities operate at the level of the pink-tide administration as well. And my main argument about those administrations is that they were fundamentally neoliberal and not post-neoliberal in any meaningful sense. And the political reversals that we have seen since 2009, they have led to the consolidation and intensification of an even sharper, even more brutal form of neoliberalism in the region. But to do this, let me step back to the transition to neoliberalism in Latin America. Now, that was, of course, the first region in the world to turn to neoliberalism since the early 1970s, and then spreading rapidly after the 1982 international debt crisis. And because the Latin American countries tended to be affected by the debt crisis early on, then neoliberalism spread within that region years before it did in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Eastern Europe, and in the Arab world. And we also can recognize two waves of neoliberal reform in Latin America. The first wave triggered by the Pinochet coup in Chile in 1973, and then was embraced by the dictatorships in Uruguay and in Argentina. And those experiences ended very badly in the early 1980s with very severe deindustrialization, enormous capital flight, the accumulation of huge amounts of foreign debt, and very profound economic crises. The second wave comes in the 1980s, and that is articulated with political, not with dictatorships anymore, but with political transitions from dictatorship to democracy. Recall that in the late 1970s, very few Latin American countries were political democracies. 10 years later, basically all of them were not just political democracies, but also specifically, they were neoliberal democracies. So the point is that across Latin America, political democracy became a tool to legitimize and to anchor neoliberalism. And those economic changes and those political changes played a very, very important role together in the construction of a neoliberal subjectivity across the region and in the creation of a social base of support for neoliberalism itself. So now the neoliberal economic reforms lead then to financialization, lead to the global integration of production across the region, lead to the restructuring of the manufacturing sector that had been built under import substituting industrialization, lead to the transformation of those economies even more into low-tech, low-wage urban services, together with a very powerful agribusiness and mineral extraction sectors that tend to create very few jobs. So move forward, we are now in the 2000s, and we see in Latin America, in several countries, the election of moderate social democratic or third wayist administrations that were committed to neoliberalism, but also trying to implement some redistribution at the margin, and those administrations became collectively known as the pink tide. Of course, none of them was socialist by any criteria within Marxism, certainly not Venezuela, much less Argentina, Brazil, or Chile. But in our age of narrow expectations and very modest dreams, the pink tide created the impression of a challenge against the neoliberal mainstream worldwide and a challenge against the US empire. Now, in the economic domain, there's no doubt that those administrations, by and large, were successful to a significant extent because of their own merits, but also because Latin America gained hugely from the global commodity boom in the early 2000s. And that is, of course, through no merit of its own. But it was important that most pink tide administrations used the proceeds of the commodity boom to distribute income at the margin, to build the infrastructure of a welfare state, and as they did this, also to kickstart, in some cases, a broad-based process of economic development. But then, with the global financial crisis that starts in 2007 and leads eventually to the end of the commodity boom by 2011-12, Latin America returns to a typically neoliberal stagnation. The resources that were being used to build welfare states and to fund social transfers, those resources dried up. And then even the strongest supporters of the pink tide administrations realized that they had actually built very little. The pink tide governments had distributed some of the proceeds of the global commodity boom, but the economic, social, political, and institutional basis of neoliberalism remained very firmly in place. In the case of Brazil, that's the case I'm most familiar with, the global commodity boom permitted the implementation of policies along what I like to call the path of least resistance during the administrations that were led by the Workers' Party, the PT. And this path was about, first of all, a commitment to political stability, not trying to change the constitution, not reforming finance, not reforming land ownership, not reforming the media, not reforming the judicial system, not mobilizing the workers and the poor, and so on. The consequence was that the PT had political stability, but it had to rely on very unwieldy political alliances at the top and case-by-case negotiations in Congress to be allowed to govern. And it became quite obvious in retrospect that political stability in the country depended on the ability of the Workers' Party to deliver economic gains to almost everyone and simultaneously maintain its credibility with the strongest fractions of capital. And they could do this only in times of economic prosperity. Second feature of this path of least resistance is the attachment of those governments to a neoliberal macroeconomic policy framework. That's inflation targets, floating exchange rates, largely free international movements of capital and international trade, and permanently contractionary fiscal policy and monetary policy. And this was meant to secure that government credibility with capital, but it would inevitably limit the scope for developmental initiatives and for distributive economic policies. In Brazil, this changed a little bit in the administration of Dilma Rousseff, but we know that it did not end very well for her. The third feature of this path of least resistance is a commitment to a sketchy version of a national development project based on the expansion of domestic demand through public transfers and through the expansion of bank loans and state support for domestic capital. And fourth, which I had mentioned before, is the pursuit of distribution at the margin, primarily through gains in low-paid employment, higher minimum wages, and state transfers. And this led to a recovery of the wage share of national income, but it left the distribution of assets completely unchanged. Now, the limitations of this path of least resistance in Brazil and across Latin America, those limitations came out gradually. First, they came out because of the deterioration of the post-global financial crisis economic environment and a tightening balance of payments constraint as the global commodity boom came to an end. Second problem is that those governments of the pink tide nowhere could address the problem of the productivity gap between Latin American countries and the advanced capitalist economies. The state could not deliver improvements in infrastructure to support growth, could not deliver improvements in living conditions in urban areas particularly, and could not change the speculative character and the dysfunctionality of domestic finance. So what we have here is the lack of purposeful public sector intervention. There was never, ever excessive state intervention in Latin America in the way that it is described in the conventional literature. So in retrospect, we look back and say, we recognize that very little economic infrastructure was actually built. Many poor people gained higher wages, some access to benefits and to bank credit. They could now buy consumer goods. A lot of those goods made in China, not made in the region, but they would still live in neighborhoods without decent transports, decent schools, decent medical facilities, without water, without sewerage, and so on, and with very high levels of crime, both outside and inside the home. So you have a situation of lack of economic prosperity, broad-based, and the perception that conditions of life had not actually changed very much. And this fed frustration with pink tide administrations. And at the same time, the economic and the social consequences of neoliberalism remain unchallenged across the region. Third limitation is that the distribution of income driven by low-paid jobs and welfare transfers is intrinsically limited because it depended entirely on the marginal income that was created by economic growth that derived from the global commodity boom. So take again the case of Brazil. This was a model of distribution that was limited and that implied that the middle class would be squeezed in 4 different ways. They would be squeezed by the preservation of the privileges of the rich and the continuity of their economic gains, because neoliberalism stayed in place. They were also squeezed by the improvement of the very poorest because of higher minimum wages and the expansion of welfare provision, up to 20 million jobs created in the 2000s, but jobs paying up to 2 minimum wages, opening up of new avenues for social mobility through racial quotas in the university and the civil service, all this eating into traditional middle-class privileges and economic spaces. At the same time as traditional middle-class careers decline because of the impact of neoliberalism, eliminating layers of middle management, banking, upper layers of the civil service, and so on. 4.3 million jobs paying more than 5 times the minimum wage were lost in the 2000s, compared to 20 million plus jobs created paying less than 2 minimum wages. At the same time, you have a deterioration in the quality and rising costs of urban services because minimum wages were rising. The extension of employment rights to domestic workers under the Dilma Rousseff administration, the expansion of means-tested benefit and transfer programs, which the middle class was funding through tax payments, but could not claim. And all this was compensated only temporarily by the expansion of personal credit and the appreciation of the currency. So across the region, the political right, the internationalized fractions of capital, and the upper middle class did not like their marginalization from power because of the rise of those new social groups associated with the moderate left and the political parties supporting the pink tide. So on top of this, after several years of disregard by the United States that was busy in Afghanistan and in the Middle East, external interference returns heavily to Latin America in about 2009. And then the political right and internationalized capital come on the attack, and they use two main tools. One was external pressure, particularly effective in the smaller countries, and the other was mass mobilization around the failures of the pink tide governments to improve living conditions and around corruption. And those lines of attack were devastatingly effective. Take again the case of Brazil. After the presidential elections in 2014, the opposition chose a strategy linked up with agents in the United States, chose a strategy of destabilization by creating deliberately a legal and economic logjam that escalated into a judicial parliamentary coup in 2016. And in doing this, this emerging alliance of elites showed that their strategic goal was the restriction of democracy, the imposition of an authoritarian modality of neoliberalism, and they wanted to eliminate government autonomy from the privileged classes. They wanted to reinforce the structures of exclusion. They wanted to abolish any possible space by which the majority of the population could ever again control any levers of economic policy in the country. Now, interestingly, and this is a peculiarity of Brazil, we can come back to this later on, you have a far-right hegemony in Brazil, despite the lack of stable leadership, despite the lack of strong social movements, despite the lack of solid political parties, very much in contrast with Hungary, India, Poland, Russia, Turkey, and the United States as well. So what happened in Brazil was that the state was, in 2016, the state was kidnapped by a disorganized gang or set of gangs of crooks, bandits, right-wing opportunists that prospered in a politics of hatred that they couldn't control and who tried to enforce an absolutely uncompromising neoliberal program that is completely incompatible with political democracy. And in the meantime, the left was paralyzed in the defensive, demoralized by allegations of corruption and paralyzed by disputes around the role of the PT in government, the policies that were implemented, and not having a program for the future. Things are improving more recently, but there's a very long way to go. Let me wrap up. So what can we take from the Latin American experience? Three things I would suggest. The first is that neoliberalism is not limited to ideology. It's not limited to policy choice. It has a material and social basis. The consequence is that neoliberalism cannot be rejected just by voting for some kind of centrist coalition that can, at the same time, win elections and run the state. And these are very, very different things. A second lesson is that to achieve democratic goals in the economy and in the political system, you have to have a shift in economic strategy. You have to create a more enabling policy environment. You have to transform the social and the political conditions that underpin the process of growth. And two, final lesson is that to overcome these limitations and to achieve the possibility of transformation, there is the issue of alternatives. We can't just say no to what exists. Mobilization and trust to struggle against neoliberalism, they will come with a positive program. You need a vision of what you're aiming for, not just a critique of what exists at the moment. And this has to lead to a project of dismantling systematically the material and social basis of neoliberalism through a set, I suggest, a set of democratic economic policy initiatives leading to a new model of development that will be based on more equal distributions of income, wealth, and power, and improved material welfare for the majority of the population. These are essential conditions for political democracy as well. The problem from the point of view, I think, as I see it, the point of view of the left in Latin America, the problem is how to create those hopes, how to develop, how to articulate this vision, and then how to put together the movements that will struggle to realize that vision. Without that, we are disarmed. If we have that, then we can think about changing the world. This is the challenge, as I see it, for the left in Latin America in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Alfredo. Fantastic. So I'm actually glad we started with you, because now I'm really interested to hear what Julia has to say about the remarks and her own analysis. So Julia, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me to come onto this panel. In some respects, my presentation is very similar to Alfredo's, but I kind of arrive at the Alfredo's starting point at the end of mine. So I'm kind of Alfredo in reverse with some nuances. You did mention before that my work has previously been on Venezuela, and I've been following Venezuela since the early 1990s. But I've decided really not to talk about Venezuela in this presentation, because I think Venezuela is so very different from what happened in the rest of the Latin American region, but also because of the nature of the commodity being oil, which I think really carves out a very different trajectory for Venezuela from other Latin American countries. So what I just want to do really is come back to this issue about the commodity boom that we had in these Latin American countries in the early 2000s. Essentially, the data from all the international financial institutions were telling us that from 2000 to around 2014, poverty in Latin America decreased from 27% to around 12%, and inequality was down by almost 11% during this period of commodity growth. So what was interesting for us, what was important, was that it was the commodity exporting countries of Latin America that obviously seemed to do better than the commodity importing countries of Latin America. So there was this kind of this natural correlation between the commodity exports and this capacity to carry out these kind of pink tide redistributive agendas. And these improvements that we saw in the 2000s, I think, were all the more remarkable because of what we had seen in the 1990s, which is really what Alfredo was talking about before, with this kind of second wave of neoliberal adjustment. There's a fantastic article that O'Donnell wrote in 1996, which I think is really helpful just to remind us of where we were in the 1990s and before this period of the pink tides and the commodity booms of the 2000s. And essentially in this article from 1996, O'Donnell sets out that the social situation of Latin America is a scandal. In 1990, 46% of Latin Americans lived in poverty. Close to half of these are indigent, who lack the means to satisfy very basic human needs. In 1996, there are more poor people than in the early 1970s, a total in 1990 of 195 million people. So that's 76 more million people than in the 1970s. And so really, I think what's interesting when you look at some of the literatures of the 1990s and this adjustment was just how appalling the economic situation was, which I think Alfredo's already discussed. And I think it was in that context that we need to think about repression, authoritarianism, and types of economic models. It's particularly poignant on a day such as the end of February when we commemorate the Caracazo in Venezuela, but thinking about the repression that went along with that neoliberal model. So then we go into the pink tide period for reasons which Alfredo, I think, has covered: the political alienation, the search for these kind of alternative social movement agendas, non-traditional political actors. But I think what's interesting is that I think with the passage of time, we can maybe look back now on this period of the pink tide and really try and think a little bit more deeply about the nature of commodity booms. And really my argument here is that we need to have a slight unpacking of the economic cycles in Latin America and the political cycles. Because my argument, very similar to Alfredo, is that the problem we have, the fundamental challenge we have in Latin America, has been one of continuity. And I would say that that continuity has been very specifically manifest in terms of political evolution and development in the region, which in turn obviously is going to have knock-on consequences for economic policy and back again. But just to unpack this on three levels in terms of commodities. Now, firstly, we've had this ongoing assumption that there's this kind of democratic backsliding, authoritarian regression when commodity booms end. I think what we also need to be thinking about is how perceptions of authoritarian regression itself might occur during a period of commodity boom. So in this respect, one of the main reasons I try at the moment to avoid doing all my presentations about Venezuela is that if this was about Venezuela right now, there would be people who were saying, well, actually, this period of economic commodity boom in Venezuela, the oil boom of the 2000s, actually, when you have the height of this economic development, that was also the height of the kind of very authoritarian trajectory that was taken by the Chavez regime after his third election, 2006-2008 period there. So let's not necessarily correlate commodity boom, with democratic growth. Actually, maybe commodity booms and authoritarian regression is the more interesting correlation that we should be thinking about and maybe unpacking. Secondly, here, in terms of commodity growth, we need to also really assess the fact that different commodities had different values. It's very different. This is why I didn't want to talk about Venezuela. I think it's very different having a commodity boom which is driven by oil than a commodity boom which is driven, for example, by soy exports, by the agricultural sector, because this has different ramifications for the way that the export income from this commodity boom is distributed, how it's managed, and how it layers onto the existing social structures and class systems in Latin American society. So let's look at commodity booms and authoritarian regression during the boom. Let's try and unpack what were the commodities, because I think this is very, very important. We're just homogenizing the commodity boom experience there. But then thirdly, let's also try and think about, well, during this period of economic growth that we saw in the 2000s, how much of that was actually specifically commodity driven? Can we try and disaggregate other drivers of GDP growth during this period? Institutional capacity, stabilization funds, the ability to kind of smooth out these big cycles in aggregate demand that we associate with commodity booms. Are there other factors that enabled strong economic performance during commodity booms rather than just the commodity exports themselves? And I think it's important that we try and unpack all of this. At the moment, the only commodities I'm interested in are cocaine and heroin. Previously, it was oil. But the key point here is really, what is the actual components of this commodity and how does that export increase price actually impact back on the domestic economy? And it's not always necessarily in ways that we assume is generating of GDP economic growth, which is then supporting redistributive economic policies. So just going on from this then to the pink tide itself, if we are going to say, if we kind of go back to this argument that Alfredo put forward before, which I kind of align with, which the commodity boom did allow these pink tide governments to have at least a minimum of a redistributive agenda, then the other challenge I think we have here is that we have to say, well, what was so special about the pink tide? Because actually this was no different from these kind of previous cycles that we've had in Latin American history of these kind of commodity booms and then, democratic expansion. And I think what the commodity booms historically enabled Latin American countries to do was to basically re-legitimize the political rules of the game, re-legitimize the institutional structures of the state, because it was conditions, perceived to be in conditions during commodity booms, of a positive sum game. So it was possible for these kind of populist parties, left of center parties, whether we're talking about the 50s, whether we're talking about the 2000s, it was possible to try and drive forward an agenda of reform, of political reform, because the economic conditions were seen to be a positive sum. Whereas previously we've had these kind of conflicts and political regression, political conflicts in Latin America, where it was, very much over a negative sum scenario, this kind of conflict over the basic distribution of resources and economic power. So I do think that the commodity booms have historically been important in allowing this kind of re-equilibration of the political systems. But ultimately, however, we just kind of go back into this regression. It's this constant cycle of step forward and then regression backwards. I think the key thing that was important about this pink tide period in terms of redistribution that Alfredo was talking about before was there was this cognizance of what had happened, the desperation, the economic and inequality level of crisis that we saw in the region in the 1990s. So we did see some interesting initiatives during the pink tide. The Bolsa Familia, which we've not discussed, the Renta Dignidad in Bolivia, Pension 65 in Peru. So we had all of these initiatives that were very strongly driven by the World Bank at the time, you know, the emphasis on trying to reduce this inequality, not just trying to push for growth at any cost, which is what was associated with levels of inequality that we did see. But as Alfredo's already discussed, when we actually look at what these kind of redistribution mechanisms enabled, it's not been sustainable long-term poverty reduction. It's not been a long-term sustainable reduction in inequality, because ultimately, even though we did see quite sizable transfers, they didn't fundamentally change the economic structures, the economic institutions, or the rules of the political game. In some circumstances, we actually saw, you know, some of these kind of pink tide redistribution mechanisms reinforcing the enclave nature of some of these Latin American economies. So, you know, I think the legacy really of the pink tide redistribution itself really needs to be kind of better understood, and we need to better engage, as I said, with the types of commodities which we see as driving this growth. Now, the key thing, just finally to kind of come to my third point here in this really, and I do apologize for it being quite breathless, there's been a lot of coffee drunk on this side of the Atlantic during the day, but just in terms of the political dimensions here, I think the key challenge, whether we've had commodity booms, whether we've had redistribution, whether we've had neoliberalism, the real problem of Latin America, and this goes right back to what Alfredo said at the beginning, is that the fundamental structural challenges to meaningful citizenship, to meaningful democracy have continued to persist. So whether we've had economic boom times in the region, or whether we've had this, you know, catastrophic narrowing of political and democratic rights during authoritarian military governments, early periods of neoliberalism, the real challenge is that fundamentally these structural inequalities are not addressed. And this was particularly the case, I would argue, during the pink tide. Certainly was not the case in places like Venezuela. But if you look at, for example, the redistribution of land, the most complex politicized driver of inequality, I would argue, in Latin America, but really no major effort to address this question of land inequalities during the 2000s, during this period of potential commodity wealth and this potential latitude to try and address these big structural problems. None of the major inequalities that drive these citizenship deficits in Latin America were addressed. And as Alfredo said, it's not just on the outside of the political system, in terms of, for example, the land inequalities that I've mentioned, the inequalities in terms of political influence and political voice. It's also these fundamental crises continuing throughout the region: insecurity, homicide, feminicide, lack of confidence in the police, lack of confidence in criminal justice institutions. So these profound divisions continue to exist and really were not addressed during this period of the 2000s. And so the extent to which we kind of saw this democratic evolution alongside this improvements in the economic situation, I say we will probably need to interrogate that a little bit more closely, because I think there was actually remarkably little progress in institutionalizing sustainable democratic and citizenship rights. I would again go back to the point Alfredo also raised about the United States of America. And I think the big challenge that we've seen there is that the US continued to play a deeply regressive role in Latin American politics, including during this period of the commodity boom. And I think what was particularly interesting, I think certainly the Clinton administration, in terms of Venezuela, when we first had Hugo Chavez elected, there were really good, easy opportunities for the United States to embrace a far more pluralistic, ideologically diverse Latin American party and political system. And there was simply an inability to do this. And this was even at the point when Hugo Chavez was talking about Tony Blair being his role model. Even that was difficult and uncomfortable for the United States of America. So really, I think, you know, until we also start bringing in, not that we've ever really excluded it, but we really need to start bringing back into our assessment the role of the United States and how far this, you know, geographical accident or geographical experience of living within the Western Hemisphere has really constrained and contained the opportunities that Latin American countries have had for this meaningful democratization still through to this day, and despite the wealth that was generated by these commodity booms. I could talk about a more optimistic note that Latin America isn't going back through these kind of economic collapses, the banking collapses that we saw in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. overall the economic outlook has been somewhat more stable in terms of not these massive macroeconomic lurches that we saw from the 1980s into the 1990s. But did the unraveling of this kind of commodity boom, did this lead to some kind of authoritarian regression? Well, I would actually say no, because I think the authoritarian regression is something that's persistent throughout Latin American history. It goes back to this inability of Latin America's elites to really broaden out this equilibrium of citizenship. And then ultimately these inequalities and this authoritarianism persists, whether we're on the inside of commodity booms or when we're in a situation of commodity bust, because ultimately I think we need to look at these political cycles moving in a slightly different sync from the economic cycles, but overall very limited change despite the enormous wealth that was generated. I'll leave that there. Sorry, as I said, if that was a bit breathless, but clearly this is something we can hopefully draw out a little bit more in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Julia. In fact, that reminded me, I just taught my Latin America week in my development class here at UCLA, and I was mentioning a recent lecture by Jose Ocampo, the Colombian economist, who was predicting a possible lost decade or another lost decade in the relationship between Latin America and the world economy in the wake of COVID. So maybe we can return to that in the Q&A. So let's go over to Professor Dan Slater and hear Dan's remarks.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Well, as you noted at the outset, I do have a book coming out, not with Joshua Wong, the Hong Kong activist, but with Joseph Wong, University of Toronto professor. He gets it all the time, not to worry. And the book is called From Development to Democracy. But it tackles the question of how development and democracy intertwine in a slightly different way than the theme of this panel. So I took Kevin's invitation to participate as a kind of invitation to think a little bit beyond the book and to kind of bring in some of my older work on development, and also the fact that, like Kevin, I'm teaching this stuff all the time and thinking all the time about how, you know, some of these insights from dependency theory, world systems theory might help us think about democratization. So Kevin's invitation came at the same time as to write an essay for an online journal called East Asia Forum. And so what I decided to do was write a piece which hopefully will speak to our themes today. But to kind of foreshadow before I get into the essay itself, let me just sort of say a few things on today's theme to sort of summarize, to kind of give you the lead. So what I'll be arguing today is that the problem in Southeast Asia is not that commodity dependent development keeps Southeast Asia locked in the periphery or doomed to ruinous boom bust cycles. These Southeast Asian economies have consistently grown at around a 5 to 6% clip, even after the end of the commodity boom that is our focus here. And they have become major export manufacturers despite their enduring resource dependencies. They are semi-peripheral, not peripheral economies. Contrary to Wallerstein, Asia's semi-periphery is populated by countries that have escaped the periphery, not just those falling from the core. Yet the challenges of moving from semi-periphery to core are proving extremely difficult, and the weak state capacity that accompanies semi-peripheral economics, which Wallerstein correctly foresaw, even without persuasively explaining it, is also entrenching semi-democratic politics across much of Southeast Asia. So we can think of this essay I'm about to offer as reflections on semi-democracy in the semi-periphery. But the essay's actual title is Asia's Elusive Northeast Passage, and I will begin reading that to you now. So right in the mid-1990s, Adam Przeworski memorably remarked that reformist governments in Eastern Europe and Latin America were seeking the Northwest Passage, a route to joining the highly developed capitalist economies and solidly consolidated democracies of Western Europe and North America. Nearly 3 decades later, that passage has proven devilishly elusive. Once vibrant democracies like Brazil and Poland have wobbled badly. Once promising economies like Mexico and Hungary remain stubbornly middle income. Wealthy democracy has emerged nowhere new in the world's Western half. Spin your globe to the east, and the story is similar. By the early 1990s, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were Asia's only wealthy democracies. They remain so today. Hong Kong and Singapore are rich, but not democratic. Thriving middle-income democracies of the 1990s like Thailand and the Philippines thrive no longer. Indonesia and Malaysia keep growing economically in the wake of their surprising democratic breakthroughs, yet those democratic gains remain tenuous and their economies still struggle to have breakthroughs of their own to the ranks of technologically advanced industrialized nations. Why has Asia failed to find the Northeast Passage to wealthy democracy, just like their Eastern European and Latin American counterparts have found no Northwest Passage in their 3 decades of political and economic reforms? Taiwan and South Korea had followed in Japan's successful democratic and developmental path by the Cold War's end, but that was that. The puzzle is compounded by the fact that no other region has pursued Przeworski's predicted path to wealthy democracy more strenuously than Asia, what Przeworski called modernization via internationalization. An easy answer is that Asia's Northeast Passage leads toward China, not Japan. It is an answer that holds much truth. China has definitively shown that decades of rapid development need not lead to steps toward liberal democratization, or even to pressures for liberal democratization. Vietnam and Cambodia are on a quest to duplicate China's path, not that of Japan and its fellow travelers. Hong Kong would very likely have followed the Northeast Passage to wealthy liberal democracy if it had transitioned from British rule to independence in the 1990s and not to Chinese rule. So perhaps the story is simply that, unlike the Northwest Passage that ran in the opposite direction from Russia's authoritarian power, the Northeast Passage runs smack into China. But that story only goes so far. Besides the exceptional non-sovereign case of Hong Kong and the formerly socialist political economies of Cambodia and Laos, no other Asian country is seen its destiny defined by China, at least not yet. Most Southeast Asian countries began economically reforming and rapidly developing well before China. They did so at a time when Japan was still both the main motor and the main model for growth. China has followed the economic trajectory of capitalist Southeast Asia far more than the reverse. Another possibility is that the Cold War era was simply more conducive to rapid development and democratization than the decades since. Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, the paradigmatic Asian developmental states, boomed and then democratically blossomed under a highly protective American umbrella. Military security was guaranteed and export markets were wide open. Communist rivals only threatened from the outside, not the inside. Ethnic tensions were basically absent in Japan and South Korea and ultimately manageable in Taiwan. Nothing was stopping them from becoming vibrant democracies after becoming successful developmental states. So what's stopping the rest? The main problem is not that China presents a more alluring political and economic model than Japan and its democratic Northeast Asian neighbors, nor is the main problem that Northeast Asia's developmental states are simply an unattractive model. The main problem, I venture here, is that obstacles to late Asian development are combining with obstacles to late Asian democratization. Those obstacles keep states weak, and in a mutually reinforcing fashion, those weak states lack the capacity to overcome either type of obstacle. One striking result is a great deal of semi-democracy along Asia's economic semi-periphery. So that was part one. We now get to part two. So given Asia's stupendous diversity, this rule has important exceptions. I've already mentioned China and the economies sucked willingly or otherwise into its orbit: Hong Kong, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Another more informative exception for the account I will offer here will be Singapore. How can Singapore's experience of stupendous growth without democratic reforms shed light on the failures of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand to find the Northeast Passage? My central premise is that strong capitalist economies and strong democracies require strong states. Neither part of this two-part claim is either surprising or novel. As Przeworski himself wrote in 1995, without an effective state, there can be no democracy and no markets. The connection between state strength and economic performance has become practically axiomatic in the developing world. Even those who think robust markets do more for economic development than prudent state interventions know by now that markets cannot become robust where states are weak. As for democracy, the linkage between state strength and democratic consolidation is by now highly familiar as well. Yet while the link from state weakness to both developmental and democratic weakness is clear, what remains more unclear is why states remain weak in the first place and how developmental weakness and democratic weakness reinforce each other. States remain weak because state building is always politically hard and risky. Unless political leaders absolutely need to strengthen state institutions for urgent purposes of national defense, or to hold together broad political coalitions through state-led rapid economic growth and downward distribution, they are highly unlikely to do so. Absent the pressures of systemic vulnerability, states will tend to remain fragmented, clientelistic, and incapable of fostering major economic transformation. They will tend to be captured by oligarchic capitalists who demand secure property rights for their own investments in low technology and natural resource dependent sectors. This might suffice to earn their foreign revenue and generate the tax revenue necessary to keep lower income and middle income countries afloat, but it does not augur the kinds of structural economic change and technological upgrading necessary to become a wealthy economy. Nor does it augur democratic health. The reason is that stable democracy rests on lasting economic bargains. Only once the state has assumed a position of economic centrality and authority will the question of who holds political office carry major economic stakes for the entire population. These economic bargains can be highly liberal or they can be highly conservative. Indeed, democratic health generally rests on ongoing competition between those who want the state to get bigger and more generous and those who want to see it stay smaller and less intrusive. Stable democracy does not require a highly redistributed welfare state, but it is far more likely to emerge when it matters economically who holds power and when voters become attached to political parties who can credibly promise to deliver them the kinds of economic policies and programs to which they've become accustomed. This is exactly what happened in the countries that successfully traversed the Northeast Passage, or the Northwest Passage for that matter, as explored by Torben Iversen and David Soskus in their book, Democracy and Prosperity. Although he could not explain why, Emanuel Wallerstein was right that wealthy economies in the industrialized core of the world economy will tend to have strong states. Those in the periphery and semi-periphery will generally not. My point here is that this has implications for democracy as well as for development. Countries that lack the state capacity to foster sustained and transformative economic development also lack the state capacity to craft sustained and transformative distributive bargains with society. Absent those stable bargains, democracy is not really about the economy at all. Elections are about personalities, charisma, clientelistic promises, and in some cases, concerns over which candidates will best protect civil and political rights. Oligarchs continue to dominate the state and prevent it from becoming an effective and authoritative manager of national economic life. Economies fail to upgrade and democracies fail to consolidate. This syndrome is global, not simply Asian. Political economists have warned for decades that developing economies are failing to escape the middle income trap. Comparative political scientists now rightly note that most young democracies are hitting a democratic ceiling. In this essay's third and fourth sections, I explore how these developmental and democratic limits, both grounded in unauthoritative states and unsophisticated economies, have played out in specific Asian cases. Now to part 3. 4 Asian countries have surely upgraded their way out of the middle income trap while building states that command national economic life above and beyond the whims and pressures of a narrow business oligarchy. 3 are the wealthy democracies of Northeast Asia: Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. The 4th is the great authoritarian exception noted above, Singapore. Although the long-ruling PAP is by no means a progressive or generous welfare distributor, the point is that it is an effective and authoritative welfare distributor. Citizens know what to expect of the PAP when they vote for it, and the PAP works mightily, and usually with considerable aplomb, to deliver the economic growth and related social programs that they promise. Singapore's voters also know that the opposition to the PAP promises to rule in a manner that is more generous and distributive and less growth obsessed. Elections are largely about the economy, and the economy is run by the PAP with the next elections emphatically in mind. This is very much like how Northeast Asia's democracies have stabilized. Japan's dominant LDP is far from social democratic, but it has the strength and authority to bind society together through a predictable social safety net, resting on the foundation of steady economic improvement it has helped generate for over half a century. Much like Singapore's PAP, Japan's LDP basically never loses elections. Yet the pressures of competitive elections and factional competition within the LDP help keep the ruling party in constant economic management mode. In Taiwan and South Korea, unlike Japan or Singapore, rotation in office is common between a relatively progressive party and a somewhat more conservative party rival. Rather than loosening the state-society bonds of capitalist management and economic distribution, this gives voters a big stake in choosing the party that promises the economic model and policies they prefer. Here too, elections have real and profound economic stakes for ordinary citizens. This makes democracy more material, meaningful, and robust. The same cannot be said for those Southeast Asian countries that once seemed most primed to find the Northeast Passage: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. It is Malaysia that has come closest to forging state-led economic bargains in the fashion of Singapore and Northeast Asia's highly developed democracies. In the wake of deadly ethnic riots in 1969, Malaysia's ruling BN coalition built a far stronger and more distributive state to prevent any repetition of the tragedy. This broadened coalition required faster growth, and by the 1980s, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad was urging the country to look east in the spirit of Northeast Asia's developmental states. Yet while Mahathir's Malaysia enjoyed considerable success in traveling the economic part of the Northeast Passage, his authoritarian inclinations prevented the country from making any democratic headway in the 1990s and 2000s. Still, in Malaysia as in Singapore, enough economic advances had been made by the turn of the century that a stable, democratic, and developmental bargain was at least within reach. Voters knew that the BN was committed to muscular redistribution across ethnic groups, but also to the rapid economic growth necessary to make extraction acceptable to its targets. They also knew that the BN's opponents, like the PAP's opponents in Singapore, were promising more universalistic welfare benefits and less emphasis on rapid growth. And the Malaysian state, like the Singaporean state, was not simply a playground for oligarchs. It was an authoritative leviathan, and it mattered economically who ran it. Singapore's unwillingness to democratize, is thus the clearest exception to the rule offered here. Drawing on conducive colonial legacies, the PAP built a mighty state apparatus that could help uplift Singapore in Lee Kuan Yew's characteristic braggadocio from third world to first. Or in Wallerstein's terms, Singapore is now a core economy in the Asian world economy. The raw materials are all there for Singapore to travel the Northeast Passage. All it takes is for PAP leaders to choose the path. And now we get to part 4, the final part. The final 4 countries that will command our attentions here can be arrayed on a spectrum of developmental success. We will move from those that have moved farthest along the pathway from the periphery to those that have moved least. As intimated above, Malaysia has come closest to matching what Singapore has accomplished economically and in terms of building state strength. Yet it is still miles apart, and in the 3 decades past, the gap has gotten wider rather than narrower. Hence, it warrants further consideration in this final section, alongside its fellow Southeast Asian middle-income travelers, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, as well as in the preceding section for coming closest to matching the trajectory of Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Unlike those 4 core economies, Malaysia remains with all of its Southeast Asian neighbors except Singapore in what Wallerstein would call the semi-periphery. Its main export is electrical machinery, but 3 of its top 5 exports remain natural resource-based: petroleum, palm oil, and rubber. Even its abundant manufactured exports rely heavily on foreign technologies from the core. Malaysia's dependent development has incubated a class of highly connected and inefficient business oligarchs with little interest in state strengthening or in stable distributive agendas. Neither the UMNO-led nor the anti-UMNO party coalition seems to possess the political will and capacity to build a stronger state to change the state of affairs. Like Malaysia, Thailand saw its best chance of crossing the Northeast Passage interrupted by authoritarian and oligarchic forces in the early 2000s. During Thaksin Shinawat's brief reign, democratic elections had real economic stakes, as elected politicians became the most authoritative figures guiding government economic policy. Thailand's old conservative alliance of militarists and monarchists prevented further transformations, both democratic and developmental. 3 of Thailand's top 5 exports are manufacturers, with gems and rubber rounding out the top 5. As in Malaysia, growth persists, but economic upgrading remains elusive, absent the kind of state apparatus capable of fostering it. Indonesia is perhaps the best example of even rapid and sustained growth not being accompanied by structural economic change and technological upgrading. While machinery exports now outpace fuel and oil exports in Malaysia, the same cannot be said of Indonesia. Iron, steel, and precious metals remain leading exports as well. Electoral democracy has had a surprisingly good run for almost 25 years, buoyed by consistent commodity export-led growth. Yet elections are mostly about religious identity, candidate popularity, and to some degree, the survival of electoral democracy itself. Indonesia's voters have not been wedded to the state by political parties offering credible developmental and distributive promises. If any Asian country captures the syndrome of state weakness, developmental sluggishness, and economically insubstantial elections, it is surely the Philippines. In this respect, it probably looks more like the modal lower middle income political economy than any other case discussed here. Among its top 5 exports, fruits and nuts, as well as metal ores, exemplify the Philippines' enduring semi-peripheral position. Little state capacity is needed to keep the Philippines open to inward investment from technologically advanced firms in the core. Elections have never had major economic implications, with this year's battle among multiple familial dynasties to succeed strongman Rodrigo Duterte as a consummate but not unique example. So in conclusion, the end of the Cold War promised the global spread of wealthy democracies. After 3 decades, it is fair to deem it a disappointment. While so much of the world's attention focuses on the rising developmental dictatorship of China and the eroding liberal democracy of America, we must not lose sight of the many hybrid regimes and middle-income economies in regions like Southeast Asia, stuck in both a developmental and a democratic rut.
Okay, well, thanks, Dan. It's a lot to think about, and I think we'll have a good discussion. We're going to turn to Barbara in just a couple seconds. I want to tell everyone in the audience that if you do have a question, we encourage questions from the audience. We've kept this meeting in participant mode so that if you have a question, you can deliver it in person over your video or in audio. So after Professor Geddes' comments and maybe a round of discussion, we're happy to feature you listening in the audience and deliver a question yourself to the panelists. So let me turn it over to Professor Geddes.
Okay. Well, let me start. Let's see. I guess I'll just respond very briefly to Dan's opening, and then somewhat more to the Latin American papers. So, so I guess the one thing I would say to Dan is I agree that there's an association between strong states, strong democracies, and strong economies. I guess to me, there's a question though about what causes what, and I guess you think that that's clear, but to me, it's actually something that would be worth investigating in a more concrete way than I've seen it done before. So then the next thing I guess I would like to do is start with what seems to me like a little more realism about democracy, even in rich, stable democracies. And I think what I'm saying here is not recent scholarship or anything except just facts, but people kind of lose track of them because they become so excited about democracy. But as a first thing, democracy doesn't automatically lead to redistribution. Now, I don't see how anybody living in the United States could have any doubts that that's true. And yet all the time I run into theorists, democratic theorists, not theorists as in political theory, and economists and so on, who do seem to have that expectation. And of course, we have a lot of models that seem to expect that, but we don't see it empirically in the real world on average. Voters in most democracies are not able to hold politicians accountable. And that's partly because they don't have much information about what politicians are doing. And it's partly because just in general, as we have again seen so vividly in the United States recently, voters are just willing to believe all kinds of stuff. And there really doesn't seem to be much constraint on what popular leaders can persuade voters to believe. So the point is just that real democracy is not very much like what democratic theory would lead you to expect, or what some economic models of democracy would lead you to expect. Nevertheless, it's better than the alternatives, and maybe a lot better. I mean, I think it does at least protect people from the most horrific excesses that governments can impose on them. And so having said that, I guess I would like to use my time to say a little bit about what looks to me like the situation of democracy in kind of broad brush strokes in Latin America in the last 20 years. So I don't think I agree with the premise of the conference that the end of the commodity boom was associated with democratic backsliding, at least not in Latin America. I'd say that the commodity boom made a very substantial redistribution possible in Latin American countries, especially those with leftist governments, but also those with centrist governments. So it's not only Venezuela and Bolivia and Brazil that redistributed very substantially, but also Chile, Peru, Ecuador. So that's partly the delivery of welfare to the poor for the first time in history for most Latin American countries. I think it's a really big deal. And it hasn't been entirely rolled back either by the less democratic later governments or by the more constrained later governments, because it's so politically dangerous to politicians to try to roll it back. So Bolsonaro, who you would maybe call hardly democratic or even undemocratic, it is still, the Bolsa Familia in Brazil still exists. It's declined in value, but it does still exist because it's too dangerous to roll it back. So I completely agree with Alfredo that the pink tide in Latin America did not change the neoliberal economic strategy overall. If I disagree with him, I guess it's on what the possibilities for Latin American governments were. He at least sounded like he thought they could have challenged it. I think that the punishments imposed on Latin American countries by the international economy, or you could call it the rich countries, are so extreme that it's not really possible for them to pursue anti-liberal policies without facing hyperinflation and capital flight and other things that lead to very severe economic pain in the whole population. So I think that they're very constrained in what they can do, and that neoliberal basic policies with substantial redistribution is, in the 21st century at least, seems to be about as well as they can do. Okay, so on the effect of the commodity prices on what can be redistributed, I guess I think that Venezuela is actually the most telling case of how important the revenues from the commodity boom were, because Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1998. He certainly had every intention and every political need to begin distributing to the poor after he was, during his first few years. But in fact, poverty increased in Venezuela from 1998 to 2003. His policies were not effective at reducing poverty or inequality until the price of oil went up beginning in 2003. It's from 2003 to about 2008 that you have the really big increase in distribution in Venezuela. When the price of oil began to fall, Chavez was actually not, they did continue with a lot of the policies, but they had to cut back on a lot of things. That's part of the reason that the Chavez government was losing popularity in the last couple of years or so before Chavez died. Okay, so the story about the end of the end of the commodities boom, or the picture of the end of commodities boom and backsliding fits Brazil quite well, I would say. That the end of the commodities boom goes along with the end of the PT in government and the return of conservative and then wacko conservative presidents, and a return to much more conservative economic policies. But in the rest of Latin America, the only other case that I can think of that seems to sort of fit that picture is Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, who wasn't very democratic to start with. So I don't know whether that counts. It seems like you should be democratic before you can backslide. Anyway, then, but I would say that arguably Chile, Colombia, and possibly now even Honduras are actually more democratic now than they were 10 or so years ago. And that, well, anyway, so I guess I guess I'd like to stand back then and say just a couple of things about democratic backsliding in general. That a lot of the research that's been done on democratic backsliding seems to assume that it's supported by voters, at least temporarily. And but the political science research doesn't show an increase in support for authoritarianism, for anti-immigrant feelings, for nationalism, for racism, for any of the things that you might think would go with democratic backsliding. It doesn't show an increase at the mass level in those kinds of attitudes leading up to the election of people who become backsliders. So Bolsonaro, Orban, Erdogan, whoever you think of as your kind of classic backslider, if there's an increase in those attitudes in the population, it comes after significant backsliding has occurred, as people are exposed to the ideas of popular politicians. So the role that something like the end of booms, financial crises, big corruption scandals have in leading to the election of executives who backslide is really just the same role that they always have, which is that people vote against the incumbents when something bad happens to the economy or when a big scandal happens. And I think in Latin America, where there have been so many crises and so many scandals, that for some countries, those crises end up discrediting not only the incumbent party, but all of the traditional parties. I'd say that's what had happened in Venezuela before Chavez was elected. And that can bring to power outsider politicians who are more unconstrained by their own supporters than politicians who are the leaders of parties are. But aside from that, that democratic backsliding is really something that's done by executives, by elites, as a power grab and as a way of remaining in power and pursuing policies that they feel blocked from pursuing by other political forces. I guess if you were going to say something about the public, it's that they don't much care about executive aggrandizement. People seem willing to accept it, either from leftist or right-wing political leaders, if the leaders are doing, following policies that people think that they want. Okay, so let me stop there and let other people talk.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. So it seems like, and I want to actually bring up and follow from the discussion that we had a few weeks ago when we had a panel on India as well, because on the one hand, it seems like there's a vicious circle that links up with different types of commodity cycles in which either we can call it state capture. In some parts of the world, the term's used quite a lot. In other parts, we can say a kind of state alliance or alliance with parts of the state with different parts of capitalist actors or firms or oligarchs that even in a process of growth doesn't engage in the type of structural transformations of the social contract that would lead to a lasting democratization. It seems like even in the Southeast Asian case, even with relatively consistent growth, so less of a kind of boom and bust cycle, we still get this kind of vicious circle outcomes. But on the other hand, so there's a kind of political economy base for why we see either semi-democracy or open spaces for the return of authoritarian actors. On the other hand, and we discussed in the India case that in many ways, even with the slowdown in India, there doesn't seem to be a lot of shift in support for the BJP and the Modi government. So the argument was put forward last time, the last panel, that there's a relative autonomy in executive power, as Professor Geddes was intimating at the end, that can sustain itself even when economies go into crisis and promises of redistribution are not held. So I wanted to put those two possibilities out there. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I also invite the audience to raise, there was a digital hand earlier. If that person wants to raise a hand again, we'll call on you. But in the meantime, let me put it back to our panelists to respond to both Barbara and maybe each other. And obviously the pretty wide variation in each of these regions, but also some key insights that everyone's put forward. So maybe let's go back to Alfredo and Julia. Alfredo, do you have any follow-up?
Just very, very briefly, there's a whole number of points that my colleagues spoke about and that I agree completely. In terms of Barbara's comments, yes, strong relationships between strong states, strong economies, strong political systems. What is the driver? We don't know. Somehow these things drive one another. Broad-based mass movements and the construction of a society of citizens, to me, are very, very important across all these domains. And Latin America has been weak on that count. Democracy or formal democracy does not necessarily lead to distribution. Yes, absolutely correct. The conventional models are wrong in that respect, that simply the franchise would lead to the distribution of income and assets because the poor would vote in their own economic self-interest. That does not happen in reality for reasons that Barbara explored and that are abundantly clear in experience. A problem that I think is worth reflecting on and that Barbara mentioned, and I don't think we can find the solution to this, is could those governments have done more? That is very difficult to answer. My intuitive response is that they could, on the basis of popular mobilizations. The difficulty, of course, is would that not lead to the collapse of those administrations through pressure of the right or military coups even sooner? This remains to be considered. It's very difficult to do counterfactual history. But the fact is that if you have a supposedly left-wing administration that does not seek, does not obtain, and does not enjoy mobilized mass support, you are at the mercy of institutional political processes that are dominated by the traditional elites and the far right. Elections for Congress tend to be very fractious, and the traditional elites naturally, almost inevitably, have the hegemony of that. The judiciary tends to be a very conservative political power. The police and the army and the whole security apparatus tend to be very conservative as well. If you are government of the left and you rely only on those traditional sources of institutional legitimacy and strength, and you don't bring in mass mobilization to the table, you are at the mercy of their willingness to accept the constitution. And as successive examples in Latin America demonstrate, that the attachment of Latin American elites to democratic constitutions is a conditional and limited attachment. So I think we would have no option but to test the proposition that it is possible to mobilize population and in doing this, lock in the democratic political process with greater strength than simply by bowing and accepting the order, the political order that is determined by traditional elite privilege. Relative autonomy of the political domain, yes, absolutely. If we look at the case of Turkey, these days, tremendous, very severe political crisis, and still the government is stable. It is generally stable, and who knows what's going to happen next. It depends on the result of the next election, but that also applies to other countries. So absolutely, and that's a space for judgment, both from on our side as social scientists, but from the side of populations that have specific interests and have to intervene in the political game in order to make those interests prevail. So yes, let's explore this space for autonomy and push for democratic political change in the economic domain and in the political domain at the same time. This is all I'm going to say at this stage. Thank you.
Okay. Julie, do you have anything to add?
Well, it was really just to go back to the points about the democratic backsliding. And I think, the real challenge, if we're going to bring Venezuela into this, which would obviously be useful, but the challenge with Venezuela is we're constantly going backwards to look at when the democratic backsliding began, and none of us can really agree over that process, when it occurs, how we time it. But I think the key thing for me in looking at Venezuela is that economic boom conditions, and it's not just Venezuela, this is something that we can extrapolate out, I think, is that economic boom has led to conditions in Latin American countries, and I would use Venezuela as a case in point, where difficult discussions and difficult decisions about institution building, about judicial reform, are delayed and simply bypassed because the economic boom context enables governments to bypass making those difficult decisions. And those are difficult decisions, it was like before when I was talking about land reform, those difficult decisions are really contentious, they're really polarizing. And so I think the tendency is for governments just to simply bypass them because that's what the boom conditions allow them to do. But it does mean that they accumulate a host of institutional problems around insecurity, as I was saying before. And to go back to Barbara's point about Venezuela and how the Chavistas were beginning to lose a lot of popularity when Chavez died, I would say that to some extent that was driven by the downturn in the economic situation. But I don't think the support for Chavez was purely driven by those kind of material aspects of the redistribution of the economic rewards of the oil economy. I think the challenge actually also by the time that Chavez was seriously ill and going into that third term before Maduro was actually the accumulation of exactly these problems that I'm trying to highlight: institutional decay, corruption, the insecurity, the failure to reform the judicial system. All of these other aspects, I think, were really beginning to kind of weigh on people's mind about the future direction of Chavismo. So certainly it was the decline in the oil economy and the loss of that kind of capacity to materially demonstrate this commitment to a more inclusive Chavista revolution. But I think also at the same time there was, and we do have to be conscious of this, real frustration with the fact that the Bolivarian revolution simply wasn't delivering for many of those people who did think it was going to be a socialist revolution or this kind of major political change. For a lot of people, by the time of Chavez's death, it had simply been, replacing one set of elites with another set of elites. So people really didn't see where that revolution was beginning to happen. So I don't think it's only materially driven was the point I was going to make. And the challenge, back to the original point, is that economic booms allow governments to completely circumnavigate, not have to engage with more complicated issues of institution building and creating conditions of citizen security.
Let me
say I agree with all that. And I think that in the case of Chavez in particular, that that the oil boom also enabled him to completely turn a blind eye, maybe even encourage massive amounts of corruption, and which of course did not go to the poor, went to his cronies and to people in the military. And that and the rise in crime and the unwillingness of the Chavistas to take that on made a huge difference in public support.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, absolutely.
Let me push Dan on this challenge of circular logics in that, if there's a virtuous circle of strong states, strong economies, and strong political institutions, then not like we can pick the one that's the causal driver, but given that, I mean, so with Joseph Wong, my big apologies to Joseph, who may be watching this at some point, that you and Joseph have developed this argument of democratization through strength. So when, kind of the political economy of authoritarianism might have predicted retrenchment, instead we get in particular cases a democratization. Is that so? In there we have a kind of arrow. Does that argument apply to this puzzle?
I guess to some degree. I guess I'd say, when people say circular logic, that the natural defense is you just say equilibrium. It's an equilibrium, right? And I think there's actually some truth in that in this case. I mean, I definitely didn't mean to imply that I've solved the riddle of how these three kind of things can possibly go together. But I guess I would say that one value of thinking about it as equilibrium is that you could sort of ask, well, which is the stickiest, which is more likely, which is less shiftable. And I guess I would say we see a lot more, flux in, democracy and more flux in economies. And that to the extent there's a, you could call it a strong state or strong democracy or a strong economy equilibrium, and weak state democracy economy, I would say the strongest case would be for a strong and weak state equilibrium, insofar as that's the hardest thing to change. But I definitely think that we shouldn't be assuming these things go together, or we should be denaturalizing the idea that they're connected. But at the same time, I think that part of what Joe and I want to do in the book is, people look at Asia and they say, first they forget Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan exist, or they just don't think they're worthy of theorizing. They're just weird. And so the real story of Asia is China booms, China doesn't democratize, ergo there's nothing to kind of the kind of canonical insights of modernization theory in Asia. And what we try to provide is a more nuanced story in that regard, which we can get into. But I guess I would just make one final remark on this. I think Barbara's exactly right about the fact that commodity booms, and busts can go in a lot of different directions in terms of democratic advances, backsliding, what have you. And I guess so I was just thinking through, so why would it be that during a commodity bust, for instance, why would that lead to democratic advance? And I guess it would seem to me the way to think about this would be to ask, which actors get strengthened in a boom, which actors get weakened in a bust. And it got me thinking about Doug McAdams' canonical argument about the civil rights movement, that basically the decline of the cotton economy weakens those actors who are preventing democratic advances, right? And so maybe in Chile, maybe in Honduras, there's something about the economic bust that weakens some of the oligarchic actors who are the strongest blockers of further democratic gains. That might be one way to think about it.
All right. Our session organizer, Rowan, actually has a question. Maybe while Rowan's asking, if anyone in the audience wants to get in the queue, please raise their digital hand.
Yeah, I have a question about, first of all, thanks for all of your presentations and thoughts. I have a question, and we've all sort of hinted at the geopolitical angle here. But if we could sort of press on that further. So on the one hand, Julia and Alfredo seem to mention that US empire or US power basically constrained economic alternatives in Latin America, and obviously put a lot of pressure onto how these economies operated and developed. Dan, in your paper, you seem to suggest that some of these developmental states democratically blossomed under US security umbrella. So if we understand now a period to be, let's say, relative US decline in US hegemony, right? Maybe not fully, but a relative decline. What are some of the democratic and developmental implications that you see for the regions and countries that you're interested in? Because on the one hand, one could argue that it opens up space for alternatives, or to play great powers against each other that we saw in the Cold War. On the other hand, as we saw during COVID, right, many countries were basically dying to, we're having a problem of foreign currency reserves. We're dying to basically gain swap lines with the US Fed. So if you could speak about, what do you think are the sort of democratic and developmental futures in this period of relatively US hegemonic decline?
We don't want to keep relax too many constants, but I want to add one more, which is I'm calling the Bob Brenner question because Bob wasn't able to make it, it seems. So Bob always asks some version of this question, so let's ask it, which is, over the post-war period, there's been a long-term decline in productivity growth. And now the China-linked commodity super cycle, commodity boom, in which had divergent effects on these different regions, seems to be tapering off with some geopolitics in tow. That in a kind of the new normal of the global economy, in the wake of COVID-19, with less demand stimulus from other centers of the world economy that might be growing rapidly. This in combination with, and again, answer which way you'd like, but there seems to be maybe the last commodity boom. Maybe there's no more commodity booms in many ways to puzzle through. So in a kind of environment or kind of economic ecosystem of declining demand from either wealthy countries or centers of rising manufacturing growth, will these regions end up getting locked in whatever particular relationship between domestic economic actors and political parties that exists right now? So do we need centers of growth in the world economy to stimulate democratization in other parts of the world? Stimulate, not cause. So let's, I know Alfredo or Julie, do you want to take that on? Plus, of course, the Yankee pressures.
I think it's very difficult to trace precise correlation between U.S. relative decline that is unquestionable and political implications for Latin America. These processes are very slow, they are uneven, and they can play in different ways. The US could decline economically and become more aggressive militarily. That's perfectly possible. More aggressive politically, overthrowing governments around. So it will be very difficult to trace a relationship. There's also a very close, there's a tension between a very, very close political and ideological and cultural connection between elites in Latin America and the United States, and the growing trade relationship between the region and China. That tension may be resolved in whichever way. We'll see how this plays out, but this will be a process that will take decades, not months. It is unfortunate from the point of view of Latin America that several countries in the region suddenly find themselves, or maybe not so suddenly, find themselves trading largely with China. China as the main trading partner for several countries across Latin America, implying that diversification is potentially a good, in terms of trading partners, is potentially a good thing, but you're also inserting yourself as exporters of soya beans, exporters of iron ore, or exporters of whatever commodity it is, underneath a giant. So not only Latin America could not converge with the productivity levels of the United States and the other OECD countries, it is now locked under an absolute giant of an economy that does have a national project. So this suggests to me that most Latin American countries may find it very, very difficult to implement industrial policies, to develop a competitive manufacturing sector, and to come out of this role of exporters of primary commodities within the global division of labor. I think that's very unfortunate from their point of view. That could become even more severe in the context that Kevin has mentioned of continuing global stagnation. Neoliberal capitalism has not been able, despite all the advantages, all the achievements, all the political and economic hegemony that it has achieved internationally, it has not been able to create economic dynamics. And it has not been able to distribute income. It has, or maybe it didn't want to, it has not been able to create global prosperity. How this is going to imply Latin America, will we have commodity booms? I think probably yes, but more in the form of bubbles that will tend to be more short-termist. But this will also depend on the evolution of new technologies. But it is an unstable future. Sorry, and economically for Latin America, it's not a brilliant future. I think the region will find it very difficult to create and sustain growth. And unless there is a rupture with the current economic model, very, very difficult to sustain processes, even similar to those of the pink tide, of some measurable difference in terms of distribution of income and the scope for the amelioration of the deprivation in the region that Julia called attention to at the beginning of her comments. So I am not optimistic. I do see scope for political shifts in the region, and it is through those political shifts that we may see the space for that political relative autonomy of the political domain that we mentioned previously to make itself felt, and for Latin America to develop alternative development or to bring into being alternative development projects, alternative development strategies. Without that, really, I think the future is bleak in the sense of inability to grow, inability to lift people out of poverty, and possibly continuing elite domination with concentration of income and wealth. So it's the continuation of a very perverse dynamics that is typical of the region and has very deep roots over there. So thank you.
Okay, Julia.
Yeah, just to go back to Rohan's question before about the US and US decline, I think, if we're looking at the very specific case of Venezuela, then, I mean, this has been an ongoing problem across Republican and Democrat administrations. I mean, when, Rohan, are we dating this kind of US decline? If we're talking about the decline in the quality of US democracy, well, actually, if we're kind of seeing that as a relatively recent thing, actually this kind of lack of US tolerance for pluralism in its neighborhood has been a far, far longer concern than US democratic decline has been. I think the big challenge that we have in the particular case of Venezuela at the moment is we've kind of lurched from, Donald Trump and his nuclear option of sanctions on Venezuela, on the oil economy and the economy more broadly, as well as the country's political officials. But this was a strategy of sanctions that actually started with the Obama administration, and it's a strategy that the Joe Biden administration has shown very little initiative or inclination of, kind of changing this strategy or giving us any kind of metrics by which we can have progress towards lifting the sanctions. So it's deeply, deeply problematic. And I think the point that Alfredo made before, which I think is quite interesting, just in terms of, the lack of US interest in allowing economic pluralism in Latin America. Well, it's very different from our experience here in Europe, where obviously we have, welfare state, we have pretty extensive welfare coverage before our own kind of neoliberal experiences, but we have a very different kind of idealized role for the state in the delivery of welfare and healthcare and those kind of things. And I think when you look at the history of Latin America, the US has never allowed that kind of welfare pluralism that we've had in Europe in its Latin American backyard. So it's always been that really heavy constraint, obviously, in terms of ideological thinking about the economy. But the United States has also been incredibly uncomfortable with elites that it's not familiar with. And I think that was the whole challenge during the pink tide, was that the people in the State Department just didn't know what kind of language to communicate with people like Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez. I mean, this, or Lula. I mean, these were just completely different sets of actors. And the US just does not have, to my mind, that diplomatic or policy capacity, particularly in the State Department, to be able to address this kind of ideological diversity in Latin America. And I think it's a real crisis for the US, which speaks more broadly than its own democratic deterioration and more towards this kind of lack of policy networking capacity within the State Department that would allow it to embrace greater ideological pluralism within the Latin American region. Just in terms of, are we going to see another oil boom, Kevin? You know, is this the end of commodity booms in Latin America? Well, I'm sure we're all kind of watching, you know, what's happening right now with Russia and Ukraine. Whether we're going to have another oil boom is, you know, really is going to depend very much, I think, on you know, how we come out of this current massive crisis. But we're in a situation in terms of oil economies where currently we have US sanctions on 3 of the world's leading oil producers, which is Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. So quite how that's going to shape future commodity booms is going to be very interesting.
All right, so we have a quiet audience today. Any other questions from the audience, including UCLA students? The floor can be yours. But
I can also speak to the question too, just to give them a few seconds. I would never interrupt a graduate student, but there was, I thought, some good questions. To Rohan, I think that I think Southeast Asia is probably pretty different from Latin America in this respect in terms of the US role. I guess my general principle would be that when major powers start declining, they don't behave better. I think that what we're seeing in Russia right now is a pretty good example of this. I think that American decline has not been associated with American playing a more positive role in Asia than it did when it was closer to its apex of power. And so in that sense, I kind of, I think that even if there are always these concerns about external dependency, I think that at least if you're as distant from the United States as Southeast Asia is, American decline is something that I think that a lot of people in the region are worried about. And then when you raise the question of China then moving in, I think that the perspective from, we talk to people in Washington, they think, well, Southeast Asia is in real trouble because they're going to get kind of swallowed up. They're going to lose all their room to maneuver. It's going to be this closure of space because of this connection to China. But the way I think it's perceived in Southeast Asia is, that China is just one more partner. It's one more investor. It's one more market. It helps fill the gap left by US departure. And I think what people fail to appreciate is that Southeast Asia is this incredibly cluttered space where it's not just the US and now China. I mean, Japan and Korea and the Europeans and the Australians and Hong Kong and Singapore. I mean, all of these investment and market connections. So China is entering this very cluttered field where all they're doing is diversifying the dependencies of Southeast Asia even further, which they see as enhancing their autonomy rather than closing it down. Now that's true up to a point. Obviously, if US retreat continues, if you get to the point where China ends up with US style, power over Southeast Asia economically, then we're in a different world. But I think people fail to appreciate how far removed we are from that, if for no other reason that, again, people forget about Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. These are massive, these are very wealthy economies, huge outward investors, and China's catching up. The big point of our book is China is a late comer to the region. It's not a leader of the region.
Barbara?
I just wanted to say something, I think, strictly on the economic side. It seems to me that if China declines or continues the current decline, that, or maybe I should put it the other way, when China is growing fast, its appetite for commodities is so large that it by itself can practically cause a commodity boom or can raise prices for commodities in Latin America. And so in the short run, that really matters to Latin American economies. But with a longer time frame, it's possible that Latin America would be more likely to diversify and to improve its income distribution as a result of having a more diversified economy that draws on more skilled labor. If China were less, had less appetite for commodities. And on the US side, I just think, when the largest economies in the world are in decline, generally speaking, that's not good for anybody, even if you might kind of think they have it coming to them or something like that. And I think Dan's point about Russia the bad behavior of declining powers is really true. I mean, I would say that Trump is also a kind of a decline symptom.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I appreciate everybody's comments, and this video will go up online as kind of the end of this quarter's thematic panels, and we will be continuing this series into the next quarter, you say, which is basically April and May. And we had long-term plans for a panel on Eastern Europe, so with even more pressing interest now in that. Who knows where we'll be by May in that region. But I really want to thank the speakers today, the really high quality of the comments. And I also want to thank Professor Geddes for her discussion. On behalf of the center, to thank everyone else who's been involved, and also thank Rohan for organizing the session today. Also for our speakers in the UK, one additional thanks for staying up extra late for us. Thanks so much.